Okay, thank you, Eric. And as Eric said, we're going to be talking about how parental alienation is a good example of child psychological abuse. Now, I think that this topic is going to be maybe a little bit more familiar with most of you because almost everybody who's a clinician or an attorney or a child protection worker has some kind of sense or some kind of familiarity with, obviously, with abuse and to somewhat with child psychological abuse. But what I'm going to try to prove to you is that parental alienation is a good example of child psychological abuse. Now, I don't know if you realize it, but I just said that slightly wrong. The correct way to say it is that the person who's causing parental alienation is committing child psychological abuse. I mean, PA itself is what's in the child, or between the child and the rejected parent. But the person who causes it, or the alienating parent, or you might want to call the preferred parent, is the person who is committing psychological abuse. In some cases, we're going to get into this in more detail, but obviously not every single time a parent badmouths the other parent is psychological abuse. But in severe cases, I think it should be considered that. So we have this outline of what we're going to do, some definitions, the injury, does psychological abuse injure children? How PA is a specific form, and then I have some ideas on what should be reported. I'm sure this comes up all the time with child protection. Is something severe enough to be reported and on the original intake? So I have some ideas about that. So I guess in the 1950s and 60s, child abuse became discovered one more time in our society. And you know that famous article by Kempe, which was called "The Battered Child." I think that was the name, the battered child, or maybe it was the battered child syndrome, and it was published in JAMA. I think that was in the 1950s. And then in the 60s and 70s, sexual abuse became more recognized and people became more familiar with it. And in the 1970s, or actually, I'm sorry, in the 1980s, I think people became more aware of psychological abuse. And this book, this is a book which I tracked this down in the library at my college. I don't have this book, but I tracked it down, and they have a perfectly good copy, and it had this kind of interesting looking cover. But the person who was the first author of this book is a man named James Garbarino. And he was a psychologist, and he's still around. He practices in Chicago. He's in one of the small universities in Chicago. And he and his colleagues put together this book called The Psychologically Battered Child I guess it was published in 1986. And people had written a few articles. In other words, this wasn't the first thing that was ever published on this topic. There had been some individual articles, but this is the first book, and it became kind of a classic. And they talk about these they gave definitions of 5 types of child psychological abuse or child maltreatment, psychological maltreatment. And these terms, they take it rather broadly, like rejecting doesn't just mean saying to the child, I never want to see you again. There are lots of different ways that rejecting can take place. Terrorizing can be anywhere from mild sort of scaring the child or threatening the child to very, very serious acts which you might think more of terrorizing. I give some examples of this later that I came across. Ignoring the child could obviously be any range of behaviors. So could isolating the child. And in fact, that's one of the things that seems to pertain to parental alienation, because when you isolate the child, you create this enmeshed relationship. You want the child at home. You don't want the child going out and playing with other kids. And you don't want the child hanging out with the other parent. In other words, the concept of isolation includes interfering with the child's relationship with the other parent. Corrupting the child is also a very broad word in their work. Anything you do to cause the child to do things that are bad, or illegal, or immoral, or a lot of different bad things. And this happens with alienation because the parent might tell the child to steal something, or to spy on the other parent, or to tell lies about the other parent. So that might be a form of corrupting. I'm going to get to this in a little while, but I wanted to give you this basic foundation from James Garbarino as to what might constitute the basic definition of child psychological abuse. So that was 30 years ago, I guess, and I want to jump from 30 years ago to 1 year ago. And that the current, most definitive, most comprehensive study of child psychological abuse today is this document. And it's published by APSAC. APSAC is the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. APSAC has been around for a very long time. They have a journal called Child Maltreatment. Any of you familiar with APSAC or their journal? Or do you belong to APSAC? A lot of child protection people belong to this organization because they focus on child abuse. So it's an important organization, and they have set about to write these guidelines. And they give the same definitions. For instance, they rely largely on those same terms that James Garbarino and his people did: rejecting, terrorizing, isolating, and so on. And they're a very nice organization. This is the document that's up there on the picture. And you can get this for free. If you just go to the APSAC website, I think you have to sign in, but I think it's free, and you can download the whole thing. I'm going to go through some of the quotations from this document, but on the next slide is the basic definition that they use. I'm going to give you several definitions of child psychological abuse, but this one is a repeated pattern or extreme incidents of caretaker behavior that thwart the child's basic psychological needs and convey a child as worthless, defective, damaged, etc., unloved, unwanted, endangered, and so on. So that's their general definition. I'm going to go read you some of their detailed definitions, because what I'm trying to convince you in the next hour, I'm trying to convince you that parental alienation, or causing parental alienation, is an example of child psychological abuse. I hope that by the time we have lunch, you'll buy into that premise. And one of the ways I'm going to do that, for instance here, I'm going to take this brand new document that only came out a year ago and read you some of the examples that they give, that this organization gives, of child psychological abuse, and see whether or not you recognize parental alienation in these examples. For instance, as an example of corrupting, exploiting or corrupting, this is not on your handout, so you're going to have to listen carefully, is this: restricting or interfering with or directly undermining the child's important relationships. For example, restricting a child's communication with his or her other parent and telling the child the lack of communication is due to the other parent's lack of love for the child. Now, you may argue, is that really corrupting? Whatever. But that is an example that APSAC gives for child psychological abuse. And I think that's really important. I mean, that's basically a paraphrase of what is parental alienation. So I'll give you another one. Terrorizing. An example of terrorizing is placing the child in a loyalty conflict by making the child unnecessarily choose to have a relationship with one parent or the other. So that's what happens when one parent tells the child, I want you to be here all the time, and you don't really want to go to play with your daddy anyway. So they use that as an example, and I'll tell you one more, which is the easiest one to kind of understand, which is isolating. Isolating is one of the basic forms of psychological abuse, and you can see how that might play out in parental alienation. Placing unreasonable limitations or restrictions on social interactions with family members, peers, or adults in the community. So, what I've been trying to show here is that this organization, the leading organization in the United States, having to do with child maltreatment, in their recent document, which has been approved by their board of directors, gives examples that make it sound like parental alienation is a type of child psychological abuse. So let me continue with my argument here. So the next picture is, of course, as everybody recognizes, DSM-4, which of course is no longer used. And DSM-4, you can do the next slide, did not include psychological abuse. It makes you wonder, why not? It did include physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and so on. I think the reason why is that psychological abuse is considered nebulous, kind of intangible, kind of hard to put your finger on, kind of hard to prove. And not only that, that book I just told you about wasn't published until 1986. So there really was very little written about it. And when DSM-4 came out, I guess there wasn't enough information to really support its inclusion. But in the next slide is DSM-5, which everybody has now read and studied and everything. There actually is a definition of child psychological abuse. And so it's included in the DSM. It's actually in the one that you have at home or in your office. Child psychological abuse has been included for the first time. And this is their definition. Non-accidental verbal or symbolic acts by a child's parent or caregiver that might result or have reasonable potential to result in significant psychological harm to the child. So these definitions, they're slightly different. That definition I gave you from APSAC tends to focus on the behavior of the parent, the caregiver behavior, and the definition from the DSM tends to focus on the result, that it's abuse if it causes harm to the child. So there's slightly different ways of thinking about this. And different states, I'm sure, have their own definitions. So that's DSM. What about ICD? In ICD, psychological abuse is included, and it has been for many years. So this is ICD, has neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and so on. As you may know, ICD is the International Classification of Diseases that's published by the World Health Organization. The entire world uses the ICD. The United States, at least psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers in the United States, use the DSM. But even in the United States, the federal government uses the ICD. In other words, if you're filling in a diagnosis on most insurance forms, you have to put in the ICD diagnosis. So it's really probably more important to be in the ICD than in the DSM. In any case, currently, child psychological abuse is in both of those books. Now, let me tell you about this one more book, which is this wonderful book called Child Maltreatment. And this isn't really a book, but it comes out every year. And it's published by some part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And if you're interested at all in child abuse, you should get this book. You can download it. You know, everything from the government is free. So you can go, if you actually simply Google the phrase child maltreatment 2016, you come up with this. And you could go back and look at 2015 or 2014, and it comes out every year. And it's usually about a year and a half after the end of the year. So this is actually the most recent one, the 2016 one. And I mention this because it does kind of make it official. In other words, what the federal government says in this document, see, they collect information from all the different states every year, all these statistics, and they publish this and they update it, and they also give definitions. And so this is their definition of psychological abuse. Let's read this together. Acts or omissions other than physical abuse or sexual abuse that cause or could have caused conduct, cognitive, affective, or other behavioral or mental disorders frequently occurs as verbal abuse or excessive demands on a child's performance. So this actually combines the effect on the child. In other words, it says different kinds of behavioral mental disorders. So it has a reference to that child psychological abuse has an effect on the child that's harmful. And it also alludes a little bit to what the parent has done, verbal abuse or so on. So I've been reading this book for years. Every year if you go on the website, you can just download the pages you want. I think you can actually send a letter to the government, and I think they'll actually send you the book. But if you have a really good printer, you can print the entire thing out if you want to. Or you just print out the pages you want. So I've been struggling with this definition for, ever since I've been aware of this book. Because I've been trying to create a campaign to say that causing parental alienation is an example of child psychological abuse. And I have tried to get the federal government to include that sentence in this definition. I've written to the guy, I figured out who the guy is who edits this every year. I wrote him a letter, I wrote him emails, and I just wanted one sentence to say, for example, causing parental alienation or something like that is an example of this child psychological abuse. And he got back to me and nothing happened. I tried, I did more and more. And I was in Washington, D.C., and I visited both of my senators, Bob Corker and Lamar Alexander. You go to their office, you don't actually visit with them very much, but you visit with their staff. And I tried to get them to intervene. In other words, I really have worked at this, and I haven't gotten very far. But my point is that in the big picture of how can we educate mental health people, politicians, legislators, whoever, parents, about this serious psychosocial problem, I just figured that was one step. So we haven't quite achieved it yet. But anyway, if you go to this book, you'll get statistics, like right here, of all the different maltreatment types. And you can see that psychological maltreatment is one of them. It's only 6%. But what's interesting is that if you look at the results by state, which we're going to get to in a second, this sentence here at the bottom is really interesting. That every state reports how much sex abuse there is, physical abuse, and so on. And they report how often do they identify child psychological abuse. And this is the percent. Some states go from 0.1%, and other states go to 56%. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that just seems odd that there's this huge range. Well, it means something, that this concept isn't really appreciated, it's not well understood, that people have different definitions. Some people take it seriously, some don't. So here are some states, one way or the other. So some are very, very low. 0.1% of cases indicate psychological maltreatment. Arizona, Illinois, Massachusetts, Vermont. There's no particular rationale to this, as far as I can tell, except different states have different hierarchies and different definitions and different training. And some of them are very, very high. Oh, this one actually goes to 63%. I guess I didn't update that other slide. Anyway, very high. West Virginia, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Maine. So what do you think? Don't go yet to the next slide. No, that one. Go one more. What do you think it is in Louisiana? Do you think you're on the high side, the low side?
High side. High side.
I guess it could be, it goes in all directions. On the next slide is the answer, 0.4%. So that's sort of on the low side. But this is, this is information that your state child protection agency sends in once a year to this federal government agency. So I really don't know how they determine this. I don't really know how they collect it or anything like that, other than that the end result is kind of interesting in how much variation there is. So those are definitions. So the next step, the next question is, does it cause injury? Does child psychological abuse cause injury? And if it does, how bad is it? Does it matter? How does child psychological abuse compare to other kinds of abuse? What's worse? Sexual abuse or physical abuse or psychological abuse? Well, as you can imagine, it's really hard to separate those out. Like in a given case, it must be very hard to say, well, which one is really operating here, or is there a combination? The other thing that is almost always stated when this question is posed is that psychological abuse is a component of other kinds of abuse. In other words, if a child is physically abused over and over again, is beaten or whatever, well, obviously that child suffers not just physical harm, but psychological harm. So, that's really important to think about, but that's why it's hard to do research. That's why it's hard to answer the question, does psychological abuse in itself cause harm? But there is somebody who has tried to do that. So this is a study called Unseen Wounds: The Contribution of Psychological Maltreatment to Child and Adolescent Mental Health and Risk Outcomes. And it's done by people in a number of different places: Massachusetts, Connecticut, North Carolina, Chicago, and some other places. And they did this huge study. Apparently there's some kind of database involving child abuse. And they used this database to locate 5,600 some children, some cases. And I guess this database contains certain kinds of information about these different cases. Some of you might be familiar with this, but I'm not sure exactly how this works. But it's a huge number of subjects. And they were able to classify the subjects in different categories. Did the child experience sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological maltreatment, or some combination? Sexual and physical, psychological and sexual, psychological and physical, and so on. And to tell the truth, the paper is really complicated to read because it has all these tables and statistics and so on. But in the next slide is their basic conclusion, that psychological maltreatment all by itself was just as harmful as physical abuse or sexual abuse. And in this study, they had 5,000 kids altogether, so the categories all had at least several hundred. In other words, there might have been 1,000 physical abuse and so on. But even the psychological abuse all by itself, I think had 300 or 400 children in it. So that's enough kids to be able. And then they asked questions about whether these children had various symptoms. And the children who were psychologically abused without anything else had more of symptoms. That they measured the severity by counting how often these different symptoms occurred. And the kids with psychological maltreatment had at least as much and usually more than the other kids. And then when it's combined, the combination is worse than any of it all by itself. In other words, psychological abuse plus sexual abuse is worse than having sexual abuse all by itself. Now, I got to tell you, I've read this article, and these differences exist. Like one category is a little bit worse than the other category. It's not as though any of them are not very bad. They all of these different categories obviously cause trouble for children and symptoms. And sometimes one category is a little bit worse than the other. And also the other thing they do, if you're interested in this and you look at this article, it identifies that some symptoms occur more with some abuse and less with other. And the most obvious one is the symptom of sexualized behaviors in children. Well, that's going to occur more in children who have been sexually abused rather than something else. So the details are interesting. But my main point is that when you ask the question, does psychological abuse injure children? People have actually studied that question. And this is a really good example of the results that they came up with. So I've tried to give you kind of your basic definitions of psychological abuse. And now I want to move on and try to convince you that parental alienation should be considered an example. So first of all, I've already given you these definitions, but let's look, you've already seen this, the basic definition of parental alienation. And then you've already seen this, and then in the next slide, you've already seen this little yellow arrow, this is the child's rejection. And then in the next slide, you've already seen this big red arrow. And so this is what we're addressing, is the person who causes psychological abuse or parental alienation in the child right here, is that child maltreatment. So, yes, ma'am. Oh, you mean right here? Enmeshed. That there's an enmeshed relationship between this parent and the child. Thank you. So just what's the research on what are the effects of parental alienation? Here are just some common effects. Some of these effects, these are short-term effects. Some of these are helpful. I mean, the reason why parental alienation even happens, why does the child adopt this frame of mind in his own mind, is it's a little bit helpful. Because if the child adopts an alienation position, the child has escaped from the battleground. In other words, part of the problem is the child is caught in the middle, and if the child gravitates to one side and rejects the other side, at least you're not in the middle of the battle. So that's something that's accomplished. The child resolves being ambivalent. Ambivalent means that you have both positive and negative feelings towards a person. And that's hard to do if your mom and dad are in this big fight. And one way to get away from that is you simply give up on one parent and you totally adopt the other parent. So that's helpful. That takes the child away from certain kind of pain and tension. And that's the same thing what I mean by when it says child resolves cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a very uncomfortable feeling when you're experiencing contradictory thoughts simultaneously. And if your two thoughts are I love mom and I love dad, those are hard to hold in your mind if mom and dad are in a big fight with each other. So it's uncomfortable. And so I'm telling you a few things that parental alienation accomplishes for the child, that at least in the short term, that makes the child feel better. I mean, that's why the child goes through this process. But there are also some bad results, and one is the enmeshment that we just mentioned, that the child becomes enmeshed with one parent, and that's not healthy. In other words, children who are overly dependent, overly passive in thinking for themselves, and develop, like separation anxiety if they move away or even go to school, get away from this parent. those are all bad symptoms to have in mental conditions. And so the enmeshment interferes with the child's development of autonomy and growing up. So that's a bad outcome. And of course, the most obvious bad outcome is that you lose a relationship with a rejected parent. I mean, that's like the death of a parent, except it's worse, because when parents actually die, I mean, obviously that's horrible, but over time, I guess there's a certain amount, you deal with it. Closure is a popular word these days, so maybe after a period of time, there's closure for the child in dealing with the death of a parent. But if you lose the parent through alienation, there isn't any closure. It goes on and on because the child knows that dad is still alive and lives in the next town or somewhere, and that dad is thinking about me, I bet. And so it's an open wound that never really heals over. And also, it's painful because the child realizes that he contributed to this, that he's a little bit at fault for somehow giving in and rejecting the dad. So these are the bad aspects. Now, I'm trying to make a case that that parental alienation is a form of psychological abuse. And to most people, it's just obvious. In other words, I realize that I'm presenting a somewhat tedious argument with different factors. But to most people, say, well, it's just obvious that if you cut off a relationship with a parent for no good reason, I mean, that's an evil thing to do, and that's abusive. But sure enough, this has been studied, among other people, by Amy Baker. Amy has done a lot of research. Incidentally, here's a little footnote. So, having to do with Dr. Baker. So I mentioned that organization called APSAC, which produced this, remember this guideline that I showed you? The American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. If you're really interested, APSAC is having their meeting 2 weeks from now, I think, in New Orleans. And if you're interested, I think you just Google that APSAC and you can come up with it. And I'm aware of it because Dr. Baker is one of the presenters. And they're talking about this very document that I've been reading to you from. So anyway, if you're really into this, you should drive down to New Orleans and you can get more on this topic. But what Dr. Baker did is she did this kind of famous retrospective study. It's not a huge number, it's 40 people. And they were people who apparently had experienced parental alienation as children. So this is retrospective, she's asking them questions about what happened to you as a child and what has become of you now. And these were her results. She found that these subjects had low self-esteem, depression, substance abuse, lack of trust. And what was interesting, that many of them, this is kind of weird, 50% of her subjects were alienated from their own children. In other words, these are people, when they were children, they got distance from one of their parents, and now they're a parent, they become alienated from one of their children, or from their children. So why would that happen? You know, why is this repetition happening? So I need to use moms and dads just to be clear, but here's a theory. That when they were a child, their mom alienated them from their dad. And that's a life experience. I mean, that was a relationship with mom that it gets fixed, that whatever that relationship is. So the little boy grows up and dates and gets engaged, and he marries a woman who's similar to his mom, who has the same personality traits as his mom. I mean, people do that. I mean, that's what men do. They marry people who might be similar to their mothers. And so his new wife deals with the marriage in the same way that his mother did. That's just a theory. You don't quote me too far on that. But that is a possible explanation for this really kind of astounding that 50% of her subjects were alienated from their own children. So what else did she find? So Amy Baker went through those symptoms, those manifestations of child psychological abuse. And she identified in her subjects each of them. For instance, the child is rejected. And she found this in her subject. Mom told us we would never amount to anything. We were just like him. So that's a form of rejection. Child is isolated from parents and peers and so on. Child is ignored. In the next slide, Amy Baker has child is terrorized. Dad would get his gun out and say he would kill himself if I didn't express my faith to him, and so on. Child is corrupted. She said she would beat me if I didn't get her some beer. So anyway, this is kind of building, it was kind of interesting that Baker in her book is building on this whole tradition of the definition of psychological maltreatment, and then she gets many examples to show that parental alienation fits into that definition. So that's part of my argument. I'm trying to give you arguments to support this notion. Here's another thing that Amy Baker did in the next slide. This is another research project that she and I and this lady in Italy did. So in the next slide, it sort of summarizes what we did. Actually, the lady in Italy did this. She had all these adults, so this is also retrospective. And then she collected information about their childhood. Did they experience alienating behaviors by one of the parents? And then she collected the information about their current functioning. Did they have anxiety or depression or other kinds of symptoms at present? And then they put all this together, and there's this graph or this chart. And I got to tell you, I'm not very good at statistics, but what this shows is that people who experience alienating behaviors as children are more likely to report psychological maltreatment, and they are let's see how this works. Oh, yeah, this is a negative. Yeah, the more psychological maltreatment you have, the less caring the parent was in terms of, as a basic nurturing, the less nurturing the parent was. And then being the less, if they're nurturing, they were less likely to have depression, anxiety, and anxiety. This does the same thing in the reverse with overprotection. I don't want to drag you down the road with all these numbers, but I'll tell you what it shows. What it shows is that adults who reported having alienating behaviors during childhood described psychological maltreatment, and the more alienating behaviors they experienced, the more likely they were to experience depression and anxiety as adults. That's simply the idea that it's a form of maltreatment and that it has long-term consequences. So this was a couple years ago, and right here locally, there are some faculty and some students at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette who have done a similar study. And so some of these classical studies have been replicated by people right here in this community. So I'm going to continue with my argument I'm making. And I don't know if you're convinced yet. But this is also sort of generally interesting because we got interested in the international picture on alienation, and I collected a lot of different articles, and I just thought it was interesting that parental alienation is described in so many different countries. And in fact, we found articles from all these countries. I mean, it's just phenomenal that the same basic thing, and this is what I would call qualitative research because it's descriptive. There's some doctor, some psychiatrist in Turkey who described one of his families that he worked with, and it was a case of alienation. Or some guy from Cuba got an article published in some South American journal that, there's people from Latvia, people from Slovenia describe this. People in Japan, I was at a meeting actually in Yokohama, Japan, and people from Tokyo presented a paper on their cases of parental alienation. So I'm going to show you some countries, but the specific thing that comes from these countries are people citing parental alienation as a form of abuse. In other words, they say lots of things, but the particular thing that I'm going to point out from these different countries are people supporting my argument that I'm making right now. So let's see, this is the first one. So this is actually Richard Gardner himself, who said a parent who inculcates PAS, the parental alienation syndrome, in a child is indeed perpetrating a form of emotional abuse, and so on, has lifelong psychiatric disturbance. So that's pretty obvious that Richard Gardner might agree with me on that. The next one is from an organization. There's another child abuse organization called Longstan. I kind of forget what that stands for, but it is a big organization that sponsors child abuse research. And they have definitions for emotional maltreatment, which included the caregiver undermines the child's relationships with other people significant to the child, and so on. So that's the endorsement of a big research entity familiar with child abuse. So the next one is from Argentina, in case you want to know what they're saying in South America. For some time, we have been insisting that there are new forms of child abuse that must be prevented and avoided. Today, we refer to when a parent influences his child to reject the other parent, and so on. Parental alienation syndrome are all terms of the same thing. So that's a good example from South America. The next one is a friend of mine whose name is Wilfried Bach, who is from Germany, and he wrote this book. The title of the book, as you can see, is Parental Alienation and Parental Alienation Syndrome / Disorder. But see this subtitle in German? So the subtitle says, a serious form of psychological child abuse. So that's an example. Next one is Italy. Incidentally, I realize it's a little repetitive, but and so I'm going overboard a little bit. But my point is, I've never read the opposite. In other words, can you imagine somebody from Italy or Germany or somebody saying, oh, we're very familiar with parental alienation and we don't think that's child psychological abuse at all? Well, nobody has ever said that. Everybody agrees with kind of what I'm trying to prove here today. And I'm also emphasizing this because, like I mentioned earlier, there are critics of this. There are people, small number of people in the community who are very loud, who say that this doesn't exist at all. I mean, people actually say that. And they come to court and say that. And they write papers in law journals and say that. In other words, there's opposition to this concept. And I guess I'm going overboard a little bit to beat that down and to say the vast majority of people who see this and write about it are believers. Anyway, go back to Italy, one more. The reason why this one is important is because the organization that published this is called SINPIA, S-I-N-P-I-A, is a professional organization in Italy of psychiatrists, child psychiatrists and child neurologists. So they talk about parental alienation. What's the next one? Is Spain. And they say something similar. Sometimes one of the parents hinders the relationship of their children with the other parent, and it leads to parental alienation syndrome, a subtle form of child abuse that they've noticed. The next one is from Sweden, which is also by somebody I know. Severe cases of parental alienation must be considered a form of child abuse, and so on. A couple more. South Africa is by Dr. Zabo, who's a psychiatrist, and he wrote this. He was the president of the South African Psychiatric Association. So in fact, he makes an interesting observation here. Let's look at this from South Africa. Involvement of mental health professionals who have no insight into parental alienation may exacerbate matters. The longer the time spent with the alienating parent, the more likely the process of alienation will be consolidated. It is suggested that PAS be recognized as a form of child abuse. Accordingly, custody may be awarded to the innocent party. So what do you think he means when he says that mental health professionals might exacerbate the problem? So this is described in our community and in other countries. But what sometimes happens, and this little example, let's suppose that the dad is the alienating parent, and he has successfully manipulated the children to resist going to visit the mom. So a therapist gets involved, and the therapist doesn't understand what is actually happening. The therapist thinks the children are justified in resisting to seeing the mom because the dad says so. So the therapist takes sides with the dad, and the therapist perhaps even encourages the children. The therapist will sit down and say, "Oh, tell me, honey, how come you don't want to go see your mom? And tell me all the reasons why you don't want to go see your mom." And the therapist will say, "Oh, gee, that's really horrible, those things that happen at your mom's house. I can understand why you don't want to go see your mom." So the therapist doesn't really investigate enough to understand that the kids are making this stuff up, or the dad and the children together are making it up. And so the therapist reinforces the false beliefs that the children bring to the therapy meeting. So that's one way, that the alienating parent has an alliance with the therapist, and together they indoctrinate the children. And so the children's indoctrination gets even more firm to avoid seeing, in this case, the mom. So I think that this is a really unfortunate thing that happens. And what's the solution? I mean, we really need to spend more time and energy educating therapists. We need to help, like in training programs for social workers, family counselors, psychologists, child psychiatrists, and so on. We really need to help in kind of enhance the training that these people experience so that they don't get sucked into this. And I'll just give you a little vignette. I still do a little bit of, I'm supposed to be retired, but I do a little bit of teaching at Vanderbilt, especially with child psychiatry trainees. And a little while back, I had them in a conference, and in fact, we had a 1 hour dedicated to parental alienation. And Vanderbilt may be the only training program in the United States for child psychiatrists that actually spends an hour on this topic. And so there were 5 of them were present, and I described, in the beginning I said, "Have you ever heard of this? Does it sound familiar?" And they said, "No, we've never heard of it." And they've never heard of Gardner or any of this. So I give my little talk, and there's this give and take and discussion. There are 5, these people are already doctors, they're already psychiatrists, they're already in training as child psychiatrists. None of them had ever heard of this, and by the end of the hour, 4 of them described having patients with this. Either inpatients or outpatients or family therapy patients. It was really remarkable that this is out there and it's not recognized. And the obvious issue is that we need to enhance the training of mental health professionals and also attorneys, because they don't recognize it either. Even though they see it, they don't realize that this is something that has a name and what to do about it. So anyway, I've gone through these different countries. Oh, actually, I think we have one more. We have the one that I always get choked up a little bit because it uses the word parentectomy. So I can't really read this because it makes me get emotional. But Dr. Frank Williams was a child psychiatrist, and he basically says that parentectomy is the most cruel infringement to be carried out against human children by human adults. So that's a pretty convincing statement. But like I said earlier, I've never heard anybody say the opposite. So if you ever come across somebody who says it causing severe, I'm talking about severe parental alienation. Somebody says it's not really abuse, well, let me know. So this leads us to another aspect of this, and I've mentioned this 2 or 3 times, but I want to hammer away at it a little bit. The difference between alienation and estrangement. And as you know already, alienation is rejection of a parent without a good reason, and estrangement is rejection of a parent because the child has a good reason. So child psychological abuse or child abuse occurs in both of these conditions, except in reverse. For instance, in alienation, I've been making a case that in severe cases, the alienating parent is committing child psychological abuse because the alienating parent is cutting the child off from the other parent. So that's abuse. But it is interesting that in the reverse, the child is also being abused. That in cases of estrangement, the child is being abused by the rejected parent, and that's why the child doesn't want to go see him. So, I mean, this is kind of an interesting situation. If you have a child who is adamantly, persistently refusing to see one of the parents, it seems likely that this child is being abused in either case. He's either being abused by the parent he's rejecting in estrangement, or he's being abused by the parent that he's enmeshed with. So children get a bad deal here, one way or the other. So there's another difference, though, is how would you tell the difference if you have one of these cases in your practice, or you're doing an evaluation or something? How would you tell the difference between alienation and enmeshment? Well, first of all, alienation and estrangement. I mean, first of all, you have to take a really good history. You have to find out what's happened with the child. Has the child been abused, or has that been reported? Has there been a custody dispute? You can't just look at a child and figure this out. You have to collect information in terms of the history. But my friends and I discovered something, which is a psychological test. Believe it or not, there's a psychological test, a simple psychological test that helps to tell the difference between alienation and estrangement. And I'm going to tell you about that right now because it kind of fits into this topic. So in the next slide is this paper that we wrote. Actually, this is the second paper. This is the paper that I had some of these reprints out here. And I think that Dr. Green is going to send the 2 reprints to everybody. But some of you may have picked this up already. So this is a test. And the name of the test is the Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire. So we did not invent this test. This test was developed 30 or 40 years ago by a psychologist. And it's simply a series of questions where the child is asked questions about mom and about the dad. For example, these are questions about dad. Dad says nice things about me, and the child indicates true, sometimes true, not true, never true. The dad pays no attention to me. Dad does not really love me. So I think there are 60 questions about mom and 60 about dad. And you can do this on a computer. All of this is online. It takes the child about 20 minutes. And if the child does it at home, you have to make sure that the child is all by himself. And we did that. We administered this to about 150 kids, and we made sure that nobody was in the room with the child who's filling this out. So what are we looking for here? Our theory had to do with splitting. That, as I mentioned earlier, one of the features in parental alienation is that the child sees one parent totally good and the other parent as totally evil. That's called splitting. And that happens in certain mental disorders. But we thought that we would identify, and people, we didn't invent this. I mean, other people over the years have described splitting in these children. So we knew that that was going to happen, but our question was, is it possible to demonstrate splitting with a fairly simple test? And so that was the test. The name of the test is the PARQ. And I'm going to show you the results, but for you to understand the results, you have to understand these two numbers. That if a child says totally good things about a parent, they get a low score of 60. That's as low as it can go. The most positive things, totally positive things, you get a low score. And if you say totally negative things, you get a high score of 240. So look at the results in the next picture. And I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. So I'll come right out and tell you where the splitting is. See this? See these children here? They're alienated from their dad, and they give their dad extremely negative scores, and they give their mom they give their mom extremely positive scores. And these children are alienated from their mother, so they give their mother extremely negative and dad positive. So that's the splitting. These are extreme results. I mean, it's really unusual to get results like this in using a psychological test on a population of clients. And this is what happens in a normal family. In a normal family, the children, in an intact family, the children have almost equal perceptions of mom and dad. They're almost the same. If you get divorced in our population, the children were a little bit more positive about mom, which is here, and a little, but they're still positive about their parents. If children were neglected, in other words, they weren't abused, but in the population we had, some of them were neglected, they start to have kind of a negative view of father. But these are the neglected children, so these might be called estranged, and they're totally different from these. In other words, these do have, the abused and neglected children do have negative views about dad, but it's not extreme. So that's an interesting thing to think about. If you've treated children who have been abused, those children tend, or almost always, still want daddy. They still miss daddy. If they're in foster homes, you come to see them, the first thing they say is, when do I get to go home to my abusive parents? That it is interesting that children who have been abused tend to still want to hang out with those parents, even though the parents have been mean. On the other hand, children who are alienated, who have not been abused, say that he's the worst daddy in the world and I never want to see him again. Do you see the word is counterintuitive? It is interesting that children who are abused still want to see their abusive parent, while children who are alienated say, I never want to see him again, even though they've never been abused. Now, there is a tiny footnote, which she's about to ask me about, which is that we realize that there are some children that this doesn't apply to. In other words, there are some children who are abused, horribly abused, who really do say, I never want to see him again, I never want to go home. So we understand that. Yes, ma'am?
Administer this to that population, the abused?
Not yet. We did have the question was, were we able to administer that to severely abused kids? Not yet. These kids were not severely abused, but that's our next project. So we have some research that is just getting underway that involves administering tests. Well, actually, I'm sorry, it involves this question, but it doesn't necessarily involve administering this test. But we are looking at kids who have different levels of abuse, and we're assessing their attachment to the abusive parent. So that'll be a piece of the big picture. Yes, ma'am.
Question on the neglected outcome, that assumes it's the father who was the neglectful parent?
And she asked me about, in the neglected column, was it the mothers or the fathers who were neglectful? And it just happened that all of the children who were neglected by the father. And it just was a fortunate circumstance. And since that was the case, you can compare statistically neglected by father and alienated from father, and you can compare these numbers, and it's extremely significant statistically. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that's a neat thing, because what it illustrates is that the mental state of the child who is severely alienated, actually changes. The child adopts this splitting, this all or nothing perception of mom and dad. In other words, that's not just a little transitory day-to-day thing. That's a change in the child's perception of the world, and that we were able to show that really happens. Yes?
I have two questions for you. One is the splitting that you observed in the child, did you check the parents to see if they had the same splitting in their thoughts? And my second question is, how do you compare what you're studying here with Rickland's earlier study when he was punching holes in the paper, seeing splitting there as well?
So the first question had to do with did we have information about the parents? And we did not, at the stage when we were doing this research project, we did not have that kind of information about the parents. That information might exist somewhere, but we did not have access to it. And the second question is really interesting. Do you remember this morning I mentioned the Brickland test, the BPS, the thing with the card and the child pokes a hole, and Brickland had this category of not based on personal experience or something like that. I forget the exact term. And so our results are comparable to his results. In other words, he found children who engaged in splitting by measuring mom totally one way and dad totally the other way, and we found the same thing. So it's another way of showing basically the same phenomenon, which, I mean, that's important. I mean, in research, that's what you do, is you do studies in using different subjects, different tests, and so on to see if you get the same results. So the next slide was our conclusion of the PARC study. It's useful for both clinicians and forensic practitioners in evaluating children when there's a concern about the possible diagnosis. It needs to be replicated. If somebody wants to get a grant and replicate it, let me know. So the next question here is, I've been haranguing on this, that causing parental alienation is child psychological abuse, especially severe alienation. So should it be reported? So I think we have a mixed audience here. We have people here who are therapists who do the reporting, and we have other people who are child protection people who receive the reports. So one of my students and I tried to come up with some guidelines for how to report psychological abuse. This isn't how to report parental alienation. It's just the general topic of should psychological abuse be reported. And in the next slide is the article that we did, Evaluating and Reporting Emotional Abuse in Children. And what we did in the next picture was to say that the person who's doing the assessment should look at two things. what was the intention of the parent who did the abuse, and what was the effect on the child? And we had this idea that both of those things could be divided into mild, moderate, and severe. In other words, in a mild case, there would be the intention, the parent does not have any intention of causing harm, or in terms of the effect on the child, there's no harm is going to be caused. In a moderate case, you might have one of these. There might be a malicious intent, or there might be a high probability of harm, or severe, you would have both of those things, malicious intent plus harm. And so here we have a little example in which we thought was an example of severe psychological abuse. And this, I don't know, this kind of thing might sound familiar, and this actually involves a divorce case, so it sort of fits our theme here. So this is about Sarah, was the recipient of mother's verbal outbursts, the parents near divorce, more outbursts, more assaults by the mother. Mother screamed at Sarah that she was the cause of the marital problems. I mean, this is a 5-year-old, so you can imagine what this was experienced as. That she should never been born, and that her parents would have been happy without her. And then she had symptoms in kindergarten, repeatedly observed enacting the death of the baby doll, saying everything would be fine if you were never born. So that's just a little vignette, which I think, is a kind of a good example of severe psychological abuse, and that if you run across something like that, I think it should be reported, and if Protective Services runs across it, I think they should take it and try to intervene in some way. So here are a couple of cases. I mean, that case we just made up. When my student and I did that paper, we just made up that case about Sarah. But here's a case that I actually read about. I read about this in the newspaper, so I can't say that this is clinical material. But it is it illustrates my point, I think, that psychological abuse really happens in the world, in our community, and we should recognize it. So let's go over this together. The little girl was injured. She had a black eye. Her mouth was bleeding. She had bruises. And she lived with her mom and her mother's boyfriend. And when the investigator asked her name, the girl said, "Idiot," that she thought that was her name. And because that's what they called her at home. The boyfriend agreed that he called her that. This next slide is a case that I was aware of in Tennessee, which is kind of interesting, because this was a criminal case in that the mother was actually found guilty of child abuse because of emotional abuse, and she is in prison. So these are the things that she did to the children. The children were not allowed to interact. She made them use the bathroom supervised. One boy had to wear a diaper. They weren't allowed to have water. Boys had to eat vomit. What comes up goes down. They were called names, and so on. And what was interesting about the case is that these boys may have been physically abused also, but they couldn't prove it. The investigators went and interviewed the mom, and she agreed with all the things she did that were psychologically harmful. In other words, yes, of course I call him a faggot or whatever. Of course I make him stand out in the street with his diaper on or something like that. In other words, I guess the lady had so little insight that she agreed that she had done these things and that constituted the evidence, and she was found guilty of child abuse, even though the actual behaviors were all psychological. Here's one more, which I came across in the newspaper a couple of years ago. You may have seen this. Do you remember this story about this little boy, the mom, the aunt, the grandmother, and so on? What happened is this guy here pretended to kidnap the boy and terrorized him and threatened to injure him physically and to put nails into him or something like that, tied him up. And this was done on purpose. He actually ended up with the boy in the boy's own basement. The boy didn't realize he was actually at home, but he threatened him and scared him to death. And the mother's idea was that my little boy should not go out with strangers. We're trying to teach him stranger danger. And so they set up this ridiculous situation in which the stranger, this other man, took him and so on, and it was just a terrifying thing. And in other words, this sounds so stupid that people would actually do this. And in fact, what is stupid is that all four of them collaborated in some way. The mom, the grandmother, and so on. And I read that in the newspaper, so that's all I know about it. But anyway, to me it seems like a good example. What I want to do, though, is specifically say that in Tennessee, I've come up with a couple of examples, not just of child psychological abuse, but of parental alienation, going to court and being identified as child psychological abuse. In other words, that was the ultimate thing I was trying to prove to you today. And we had a couple of cases in Tennessee where the court said that causing parental alienation is child abuse. And the two cases, I don't know these people personally, but these were appellate cases. So the only reason why I know it is because they were published somewhere as an appellate case, and we came across them. So let me just summarize these two situations. So the first one is the Kremens case from a couple of years ago. And in the next slide, it summarized what happened. The trial court found that mother had encouraged and instructed the child to lie about father to one of the child's prior psychologists, and the guardian ad litem, and also to lie to the guardian ad litem, which the court found constituted psychological abuse. The trial court found that mother had tried to scuttle the relationship between the child and the father. So in this case, this statement came out of the appellate ruling, in which the appellate ruling is quoting the trial court, which said that the mother was interfering with the relationship and was instructing the little boy to make up stories. So that's what happens in parental alienation. And so not only did the trial court found that was abusive, so did the appellate court. Now, this was not a criminal case. This is a child custody case. But my point is simply that the court found that it was abusive to engage in those behaviors. So that's one I found in Tennessee. Here's another one, McLean case, and let's read what they said. In this case, the appellate court is quoting the expert who testified. The appellate court quoted the expert, "The phenomena of parental alienation are well recognized internationally," that's what I just said, "and sadly are frequently alleged or encountered in custody and visitation litigation." So, and then the appellate court quoted the trial court and said, "The court does find and does believe that parental alienation is a form of emotional abuse that should not be tolerated." So this also was not a criminal case, but it was a domestic, it was a child custody case. So I don't know if you can dig around and you might find similar cases in Louisiana, but I don't know, I just think it's kind of convincing that in these appellate cases that not only did the trial judge hear all this information, made a decision, wrote it down, but then when it gets reviewed by an appellate court, they say the same thing, and they say directly, causing parental alienation is child psychological abuse. So what have I been saying today? Here are some conclusions. Maybe I convince you that causing severe parental alienation is a form of child psychological abuse. And secondly, causing severe parental alienation can be diagnosed. And, I already told you that it's in DSM-5. Child psychological abuse is in DSM-5, and you can use that as a diagnosis. if you're a clinician. And parents who knowingly cause severe parental alienation should be reported to child protection. I keep using the word severe, so maybe I should just make sure you know what that definition means. Like most things are mild, moderate, and severe. And mild cases are the early cases. It's really easy to intervene in mild cases. You can coach the parents or tell them what to do, or sometimes the judge tells them what to do. In mild cases, the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, and the child goes anyway, and once he gets there, he's fine. In other words, he verbally avoids or tries to avoid seeing the other parent, but once he's with the other parent, it works out fine. We would call that mild. I mean, obviously that's not reportable to anybody, but the judge or the therapist might caution those parents and tell them to help the child have a good relationship with both parents. Moderate are cases where the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, but the child goes, but is not fine, is oppositional during the entire time that the visitation happens. You know, the child goes to his room, he doesn't come out, he doesn't have dinner at dad's house. In fact, he takes his own food. Some of these children take a backpack and they take food from the mom's house to the dad's house so that they can stay in their room and not have to eat the food from the dad. They won't go to a movie, they won't watch TV, they simply isolate themselves and are very disrespectful of the parent that they're with. So we would call that moderate. And in severe cases, the child says, I don't want to go see the other parent, and doesn't go. In other words, in a severe case, the child doesn't want to go see dad at all. And the preferred parent isn't helping it. The preferred parent says, oh, you can decide, you can do what you want. I'm not going to make you go see dad. If you don't want to go see dad, you don't have to, and so on. And the preferred parent may even say, oh, I understand why you don't want to go see dad. I didn't want to go see him either. You know, so stay home. And I had one case where the preferred parent was the dad, and the kid said, I don't want to go see mom, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I asked them, well, what did you do that weekend? And they went fishing. The little boy stayed home, and the dad entertained him, and they both went fishing and had a good time instead of having their visitation with their mom. I mean, that's you know, if a child says, I don't want to go to school, I refuse to go to school today, the dad would not take him fishing. You know, something else would happen. So it's just that the preferred parent, the alienating parent, do all sorts of things to encourage the child to not go. So we would call those severe when the child isn't going at all. And you know, like that test that I showed you, the Park test with the bar graph. So those were severe cases. Those children had not seen the other parent for years. You know, usually these severe cases go on, and it's a year or 2 years or even more before the court steps in and there's some kind of intervention that might work. So that's my case here for saying that causing parental alienation is a form of child psychological abuse. Yes, ma'am.
As you pointed out, we have child protection workers here, and if they have any input about these kind of reports, I would appreciate hearing them. I've been in the position of making reports, and I don't always know the outcome, and would love to hear if they have any advice about how to make these reports effective.
So this is a challenge to those of you here who might work for Child Protection Agency. And what the lady said is what do you do? What do you do if you get a report of psychological abuse pertaining to alienation? How would you handle it? Or do you have any thoughts? Does anybody want to stick your neck out about how you might handle that?
Or advice for us.
Or advice. Or advice for people in the community who are seeing the children? If you do, you can come up and use the microphone. Or you might go chat with this lady during lunch and give her some advice.
We've got a volunteer.
Come on. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Katie Mitchell. I'm the Child Welfare Manager for Lafayette and Acadia Parish. I'm Katie Mitchell. I'm the Child Welfare Manager for Lafayette and Acadia Parishes. Whenever you're making a report of emotional maltreatment to the agency, you want to be very specific on the behaviors that the parent's exhibiting and what that negative effect is on that child, and maybe an outline of, a timeline of when this is happening, what's happening, and just be very specific. So you'd call the hotline, make that report. It comes to our office, and then once it's assigned to an investigator, we would depend on basically the counselor to give us that information and verify that this emotional maltreatment is diagnosed or is happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.